Hello, really gorgeous to be here again. I am really especially excited about this particular topic, and I'll say why in a moment. But yeah, if you are joining for, as in you've joined before, welcome back. Even though there isn't that kind of back and forth between us, as there would be perhaps in some other kind of lives, I just really love having your energy with me as I'm creating this live. For me, there's something in that way of creating something that for me feels just so much more alive and juicy than me just recording to video, or even just recording to audio, given this initially was meant as an audio show. So thank you so much. It does mean a lot to me. There's something just really magical in this way of co-creating. Okay, so for those of you not joined this before, this that I'm doing right now, for the reasons I've just explained, is the live making of the monthly show called All the Everything, that then goes out as the show proper on our audio podcast, The Primal Happiness Show. So only from the bit where I'm about to say hello all over again, that is when the show itself starts. This is kind of like a bit like a pre-show where we just get to kind of hang out and I kind of witter on like this for a bit. So that's what we're doing right now. And it's also why when I say hello and welcome all over again, that's why I'm doing that, because that is actually the start of the show. Which reminds me, I was going to start to be sensible and only start recording it at that point so that we had a clearer edit point. So note to self, remember to start recording it when it's the actual show. I think other than that, I'm good. Got my camera, got my lights in the right place, almost the right time. I think I know what I'm doing. I think I'm almost ready to begin. And it's starting to feel fairly okay being here in my new home in YouTube. It took a bit of adjusting to from my old home over on Facebook. And I think this is actually going out on Facebook as well. I don't know what the team have done. So if you're watching from Facebook, hello. I'm here over on YouTube land, and it's really nice to see you over there too, if indeed I'm there. I have no idea how this works. Okay, let's begin. Hello and welcome to June's All Thing. Hello, and I am so thrilled to be here, particularly thrilled this month for a couple of reasons. One, it really hit me yesterday how much I love creating video content. I don't know why it's only just dawned on me, but I was planning this show. And if you're listening to the podcast, the reason I'm saying video content is right now I'm doing this live on video as well. And I was saying to my husband, it's just really hit me. I love creating content of all kinds. I love creating written content. I love creating audio content. I love creating video content. But it just suddenly hit me how thrilling it is for me to be able to do this in this like dual medium where it goes out both as visual content and audio content. And there is something extra juicy in that again only just hit me yesterday. Don't know why it's taken so long after all these years. And also as ever, a lot of resistance. It took me a really long time for me to actually dare to do live videos or any videos at all. And then it took a long time to actually enjoy them. And so I suppose it's no wonder it's taking all this time to finally realize, like, I actually really enjoy it. So that's one reason I'm extra thrilled. The other reason is the topic of what is the topic called? Let me just find it. Owning your difference as a superpower for your highest good. This particular topic is so close to my heart, and I actually hadn't realized how much it is until I started to ponder what I was going to be talking about. And it's couldn't be more aligned to me, my work, how I be, how I think. And it was one of those ones where it's so the water I swim in. It wasn't until I started to plan what I'm going to say. I mean, I never plan kind of what I'm going to say, I just sort of plan specific things I want to touch on. And then you should deviate massively. But it was only as I started to plan that I realized, like, oh my goodness, this is an incredible topic. So if you took part in the poll last month for this, well, if you took part in the poll, full stop, thank you. Love the fact that you are voicing your desire in that way. And then, you know, particularly thank you if you voted for this particular topic. I was so glad that it won. I really was. So thank you. So as ever, I'm going to start with what I've been creating and consuming over the last month. And then we're going to dive deep into the main topic. So what have I been consuming? And this one was actually quite an easy one to pick. Sometimes I struggle where I'm trying to pick what will be the most interesting thing to share. But this time it was super easy because, as you may have already heard me talk about, I spent 4 days in the woods, deep in shamanic practice, which of course in itself is a blend of both creation and consumption. But talking specifically about the consumption elements of that, it was such a joy to be on the receiving end of someone else's teaching and holding and guidance in that way. As someone who spends a lot of time creating things that are for others to learn and to grow from, it was so good. I mean, just to be clear, this isn't just like the only way I ever consume other people's guidance and teachings. I invest so much time and money in my various kind of teachers, coaches, trainings all the time. But to have 4 days just immersed in consuming this just absolutely aligned and magical material was just such a gift, such a gift. And this is really when we talk about consumption, of course, that can be quite mindless, unconscious consumption, as it often is in our modern culture. And not to say that there's no place for that. You know, sometimes that is actually what really hits the spot and what's necessary. But really, when I'm talking about consumption on this show, I'm really talking about that very conscious, aligned consumption, which is really allowing us to nourish that cycle of creativity where it really does require us to be consuming in all the different ways in order to kind of like get that material that we then alchemize into what we're creating. So for me, spending those 4 days in such aligned consumption was beautiful, absolutely beautiful, which then brings me to what I've been creating. And my intention is, and I've already made a start on this, is to share specific, I've called them, I may change the name, but for the moment, if you are on our YouTube channel, you'll see that there's a video I created this week called something like Shamanic Download Number 1, Women's Fear of the Wild Man. And this was something, an experience I had during those 4 days that I then wanted to share the kind of teachings, the revelations that occurred for me. And so my intention is to continue to do so. So because this, you know, I'll be doing these trainings over the next 3 to 5 years. So I'm going to have a lot to share. So my intention is to very specifically, although of course, I'm sure I'll be talking about various things in all the ways, I want to really specifically create these bite-sized downloads, revelations that I take. So they'll be quite short little videos. The one that I did the other day was just 15 minutes. I suspect the others will be a similar length, maybe a little bit shorter, a little bit longer, but very specific revelations, downloads, insights that I took from that time. So I've got at least 2 more that I plan to do that were based on things that I took from that last 4 days. And then I will be going on the next 4 days deep into the woods in shamanic training. later on this month. And so this will be something I'll continue to do over time. So that was my creation. Again, really a good example of how we can use that cycle of consuming, creating in that very inspired, aligned, activating way. Okay, I'm going to take a mouthful and a breath. I'm on my first drink, which is freshly ground black coffee, and then I'm going to move on to my mint tea. Okay, so let's dive into owning your difference as a superpower for your highest good. So before we start, this isn't going to be quite such an interactive class as the last one I did on money, but I would still like to invite you to really actively engage in it as much as you can. So I'm going to start by asking you some questions, which I believe will really help you get the most out of this. Of course, it's only ever an invitation. I'm not going to force you to answer these questions, but I think you'll find it really helpful if you do. So super simple questions. The first one is, what are your differences? What are your differences? And when I am asking that question about differences, there's no right or wrong way to consider something a difference. If it feels like a difference to you, and I'm going to give some examples of both differences that were shared in our Facebook group by members, and then also some of my own differences later on in the show. And they really vary. They really vary from life choices to disabilities to certain traits. I mean, they are the whole range of ways that we can be different. So don't feel kind of like, oh, it has to be a certain kind of difference. If it feels like it's a way that you are different to others, include that. Okay, moving on to the next one. Do you struggle with those differences? Do you struggle with those differences? And maybe just make a note that you can obviously write yes or no, but maybe just jot down some ways that you struggle with those differences. Okay. No, it's not last question, actually. Penultimate question. Do you see them, those differences, as gifts or superpowers? That's kind of like one and the same. I'm using the word gifts and superpowers interchangeably, and I probably will through the show. So do you see them as gifts or superpowers? And then the last question, do you see them as both something you struggle with and also a gift or superpower? And as ever, there's no right way of answering this. Really, the invitation is to drop into that truth of your lived experience. Just recognize what is there. There's no need to make that something different to what it is. Wonderful. Okay. So here are some of the differences that were shared in our Facebook group. So I asked a question, and I think the particular question I asked was something like, what are the differences that you struggle with most? So there was a very, there's a kind of leaning towards struggle as opposed to differences overall, just to say that. And I've summed these up, and these aren't verbatim. So here are some of the differences, and a lot of these were shared by several members. There were a lot of them weren't just one person saying it, a lot of them were in common, which I think is partly because the kind of people that are in our community often are people with differences. So I don't think this is necessarily in common with the wider population necessarily. I think we do tend to attract people with differences for a number of reasons that will probably become clearer as I go on, actually. And just say, we love that. We love that we bring the people with differences into our virtual home. So here are the differences. Sensitivities, and those sensitivities absolutely include kind of emotional and physical, and I suppose you could say I suppose the whole range of ways that we can be sensitive, so spiritually, physically, emotionally, and spiritually. Needing a lot of downtime or time to oneself, having a very fast brain, disabilities, and I would say they included both physical, so they all come under maybe the bracket of physical, but of course they can then create other differences that are not necessarily physical. Being a night owl, being too kind of dreamy, otherworldly, maybe idealistic. And I think at least 3 people all said autism, whether they called it Asperger's or being autistic. So a real mixture then. Again, it was interesting to see how many times the same things were being shared by several members. And so before I go on, I just really want to make this clear. Everything I say from this point on is not about bypassing or making light of the very real challenges that can come from differences. It's about acknowledging the truth of that and making an invitation for all of us to create our lives in a way in which our differences absolutely can be gifts, can be superpowers that benefit ourselves and the world. So when we go to the highest good, we're talking about those differences as our highest good, that's what we mean, really allowing them to become something that's medicine for the world. Okay, taking another quick breather, and then we're going to really dive in. So firstly, I wrote a post, I think about a week ago, talking about fairness and about how when we look to nature, we are very accepting of the way there's so many differences in nature. So we don't necessarily expect things to be equal or fair, because we're recognizing all those differences are part of what makes that beautiful whole. And so I want to start there, because I think recognizing the ways that differences can be what creates the beauty, what creates the functionality, even what creates the magical wonders of life on this planet, that feels like it's more readily available for people to see when they're able to look out to the natural world. So just want you to take a moment just to really land yourself in a memory perhaps of being in the wild and really noticing all the ways that the different parts of that experience, whether it be the different kinds of plants, trees, the different kinds of birds, the different kinds of insects, maybe other kinds of animals, the earth, the sky, the weather patterns. Just notice all the different things that created that, probably, if it's a memory that stuck with you, probably quite awe-inspiring whole. Just give yourself a moment to really feel into the way that each of those differences played their part. Wonderful. And now let's look at how this is also true for humans. And as ever, it makes sense often to look at humans in a more natural setting. We've got ourselves into such a distorted, disconnected way of living, mostly in this modern world, that actually looking at a more Indigenous life way is often much more revealing of what's true for humans than to try and look at what's going on currently in our modern world. And certainly when we look at humans, even now, still living in Indigenous life ways, but also what we know of humans historically, there was a much deeper understanding of both the differences between us and the whole, so how we interact with all of the other life on this planet, and honoring those differences, not seeing differences as meaning something's worth more or less. So a real reverence for other forms of beings, other animals. There isn't this sense of, well, humans are different to, I don't know, the deer, therefore humans are better than the deer, therefore we should treat the deer as if it's worth less, it doesn't warrant the same kind of reverence for life that we would give to humans. There is an inbuilt understanding, and I say inbuilt because I think even with the deep intention for us modern humans to approach that kind of reverent, connected way of living, I think it's challenging for us to really feel it in that kind of, again, in a inbuilt way that indigenous humans do when that's how they've been raised. That's just the life way, the worldview that is just baked into that culture. So again, there's this real sense of reverence, honoring, understanding of the differences between humans and the rest, but also within that village, that community of other humans, this sense that it is the differences that create that blended whole, that way that whole functions. So if everyone in that community had the exact same strengths, it wouldn't work very well, because chances are the way things work, they would also have the same limitations or weaknesses or areas they weren't so strong. So there is a much better understanding that we all came here as a unique gift, and the more people are allowed to be themselves fully, the more they'll be able to take their right place within that community. So there is a much greater understanding, and specifically, I'm going to talk more about this when I start to share my own differences, but really specifically when it comes to roles like the shaman or the medicine man, medicine woman of that community, the specific differences that create someone who is naturally more wired for that particular role, that is something that is identified and honored and guided into. They aren't differences that are seen as a bad thing. They're seen as differences that, again, that are very needed for that community to function as a whole. So that brings us to where we are in today's modern culture, which is night and day different to that. We have such a lack of understanding of what it means to live in a way that allows that sense of deep, deep connection with ourselves, others, and the whole. And so we've taken things that we do understand and then have created distortions out of them. For example, humans as a species are naturally generalists. We're much more generalists than other animals in that we are quite good at a number of things. We're not as fast as many other animals. We aren't as, I don't know, fierce and strong as other animals, but across the board, we've got a kind of fairly good mix of skills. But what we've done in this modern world is then created this kind of hyper generalization, or this worshipping this, oh, we should be good, therefore, at all of the things that our modern culture values. And so if you aren't good at whatever the particular requirements are of, you know, that particular culture or family or business, there is something wrong with you, because you should be able to do all the things. You should be able to deal well with numbers. You should be able to deal well with written and verbal communication. You should be able to organize your life. Like, all the things are seen as this kind of absolute, this is totally expected. Totally expected. There is something wrong with you if you are not able to kind of meet this requirement. We start this really young in schools, where we push children through this school system that's absolutely measuring children in that way, where instead of recognizing that children will naturally have differences that are perfect, there's nothing wrong with those differences, we're trying to move them so that we're hitting this same bar across the board. So first of all, there is this recognition, if we're wanting to allow our differences to become superpowers, we also need to recognize we don't have to opt into this cultural belief that we have to be a jack of all the trades that the modern world values. We absolutely can allow ourselves to be masters of some trades, allow others people to be masters of others. Like, that is absolutely okay. And again, in order for us to be able to see those differences as superpowers, that's required. It's not going to work if you are still trying to be good at everything. It's required that you are sovereign enough to say, it's okay, I don't need to be able to hit this bar in order to be able to be approved of and to fit in. It really does require this, like, opting out of that, and opting in more so into a much more generative way of being. The second thing is to recognize that what we're not so good at almost certainly reveals something that we are good at, if we're willing to see it that way. So I'm going to talk much more about that and give personal examples in a moment, but the way that we can recognize, like, well, I'm not so good at dealing with a kind of barrage of sensory inputs, whether they be sounds or smells or bright lights. That might be something we could easily deem as, like, I'm not good at that. There's some truth to that, but what we're really missing when we just stop there is the way that reveals something that we actually are really gifted at. So this is, again, the deep invitation here is to recognize that hidden beneath those things that we might say, I'm not good at this, I'm not good at that, I'm terrible at that, there almost certainly is a very good reason for that. And if we are prepared to go deeper, we'll see there is a real gift in that difference, in that thing that we're saying we're not good at. The next thing is recognizing that those things that we aren't so good at are often going to be things that someone else in our community is really good at. And by allowing ourselves to have those needs, so have those support needs, we're allowing someone else to meet those. And this is, again, going back to that Indigenous way of being with other people. It creates that sense of interdependence. So yes, we're sovereign beings, and we're part of a community that has interdependence between us, where what someone is able to bring to the community is valued by other people in the community that doesn't necessarily have that particular skill or gift, and vice versa. Both are needed. Both are needed. We all have value. We all have gifts that, again, when we're able to be ourselves fully, can be received by others fully in that way. I am going to take another breather, and then I'm going to share a question that Sarah from our team asked, which I think is a really good question. It makes it very practical and very real, and so allows me to kind of speak specifically to what's required for us to start to move into this way of being where we can see ourselves as gifts. So Sarah asked, Leanne, the question I have is around what someone could do in an environment where they don't feel comfortable outing their superpower, and what they really need to really thrive. What I mean is, when I worked 9 to 5, I just covered up best as I could, not being able to do parts of the job. This mainly resulted in changing jobs every 1 to 2 years, not to be found out. We joked that when we were looking at the types of work I could support Teen Waking the World with, it was if Carlsberg did interviews, because I got to say all the things I can't do or struggle with, and then what would enable me to be in my zone of genius. How does that happen when many employers are conditioned to see limitation and are fearful of offering different rules for one than another? How do we get our needs met? How can we really show our superpower? So, in short, the kind of really short answer to this is it requires us to have that clear understanding of our differences. That's where it all starts from. Us trying to bypass or disassociate or pretend those differences aren't there is not going to be is not going to allow us to identify what that is really trying to provide to us. So that's the first thing, understanding those differences, which might sound simple, but hey, it's certainly taken me a lifetime to understand some of mine. So even if you are assuming you know your differences, I suspect you would benefit from further inquiry around that. Then understanding what our needs are. Understanding, okay, so understanding those are the differences. What are my needs? Understanding, as I said earlier, what are those superpowers? What are those gifts that are revealed by whatever is that thing that we're holding right now? Is that kind of like, oh, I'm not so good at that, or I've got this kind of quirky way of being, recognizing how it can be a superpower. And then, as something I have spoken about in probably one way or another in every show I've ever done, that focus on that soul vision, what we really are here for, and moving into sovereignty so that we can create it. That's what this requires. I'm going to, again, talk about examples from my own life that's going to hopefully illustrate this and bring it to life, so it doesn't just sound like a nice, neat, like, this is all you need to do. Because I so appreciate each part of that is going to require quite a lot of us in order to be able to move through and alchemize these differences into superpowers. So I'm going to share as much as I can, as much detail as I can on that. But again, first and foremost, recognize this isn't something that we can kind of like just click our fingers and just like, okay, from now on, I'm just not going to see this as a struggle. This really requires focus. And again, specifically focus on our vision. What is this we're moving into? So some of the differences that are here for me, and some of them are kind of past differences, but I'm going to share them anyway, just so you've got a better sense of me and what I've journeyed through. So the first one is being partially deaf. I have a condition, it's a inherited condition called otosclerosis. And in short, it means the tiny, tiny bones in my ears grow too much, keep growing, which means then I think it's like the bit the hammer hits the anvil or something like that, can't do that because it's kind of like glued together by bone. So this came on, I think it started to come on in my 20s, I think, was probably when I noticed it. It may have been happening before, but I certainly probably was happening before, but there was a point where it actually was starting to affect my hearing in a way that actually was noticing it. Thinking back, I probably did notice it before, but was just thinking, it's strange how I can seem to hear people better when I'm standing on this side rather than that side, but I wasn't putting two and two together until it got bad enough where I realized, like, hey, I basically can't hear in this ear at all. I think I was actually talking to someone and noticed that if I had my head on the pillow in a certain way, I just couldn't hear them. So that was the first time I really recognized, like, hey, there's actually a problem here. This isn't just a quirky thing where I prefer to stand on a certain side when I'm talking to someone. I actually had an operation about 3 years ago where they've replaced that bone, I think it's the hammer bone, with I think it's a silicone version of it. So in that ear, my hearing is now restored almost to, it's not quite, but almost to a normal level. My other ear is pretty much done. I can't really hear anything in that one. So I'm still partially deaf now, albeit for me, it feels like, oh my God, I've got amazing hearing compared to where I was. I'm also autistic, which is something that I only found out for sure, I think it was last month. And I shared that on last month's All the Everything, actually. And so I was very, very aware of the differences that I had between me and other people, but I had no idea until, again, well, I suppose I started to get an understanding of that over the years, probably over the last 7 years. I started to suspect I could be autistic, but it was only last month that I knew for sure. So again, these differences weren't news to me. I was painfully aware at times of the ways that I struggle, of the ways that other people struggled with me. I didn't know until fairly recently that overall could be just put under the umbrella of autism. And I'll talk a little bit more about specific aspects of that in a moment. The other difference I had for many years now isn't the case, but I want to share this anyway because I, again, want to just give you a full picture. For about 15 years, I had chronic facial pain, anxiety and panic attacks. And then also, this might sound like a bit of an odd one, but I've been vegetarian since birth and I've been vegan for 25 years. Which might not sound like a major difference, but I'm bringing this in because I think it links to something else that I've really seen recently, that not just because of being autistic and not just because of being vegetarian, but in general, I was quite a different child. My upbringing was extremely rare in our culture. It was a very kind of like wild and hippie upbringing where, you know, for a year of my life, we were traveling and kind of sleeping out under the stars. Where, for example, my friends at school were going off to kind of package holidays, we would spend the time, I don't know, at the Glastonbury Festival, but kind of going between festivals and festivals. So it was a very kind of like eclectic upbringing. So you can probably imagine I stood out like a sore thumb, this kind of like quirky vegetarian at a time where no other children were vegetarians. I mean, I literally never used to meet other vegetarian children. So I was certainly the only vegetarian in my school, right up, I think, all the way through into secondary school, actually. And I just had this very like unusual parenting, upbringing, the way we lived and everything. All of those were real differences that I see were actually, whilst there were definitely challenges that came from those differences, including being bullied, there were also real benefits too. So I think that's everything. I'm sure there's other things that I'm different as well, but these are the main things. And I think a lot of the individual differences now fit quite neatly as being an aspect of autism. So again, I'll go into a bit more detail of that in a mo. But suffice to say, I am at a point now where I can very much see the gifts in all of those differences. Some of them have, the ones that are kind of still here or seem, you know, particularly relevant, very much I relate to as superpowers. But even the ones that not necessarily superpowers, I certainly can see there's real gifts in each of those. So I'm going to just, because there's a lot there, I'm not going to go into depth into each of them, but I'm just going to probably focus primarily on the deafness and autism. So firstly, being deaf, I probably don't need to go into detail to explain why that was a struggle. So specifically, I'm going to talk about how these have been struggles for me before I go any further. So specifically, I don't probably need to say why being deaf was a struggle. I'll explain this to you in a way that you might be able to kind of get a sense of the experience. We watched a film, my husband and I, about a man who went deaf because of playing loud music, I think. It was actually a really good film, but I can't remember the name of it. I'll try and find out so we can put it on the show notes. And watching that happen for him was actually really hard for me to watch, because it was just like, oh my gosh, that's how it was. As he was describing his experiences, now kind of giving the viewers a taste of that, it was so experiential in a way that I was just like, oh my gosh, that's so how I used to experience it. And I never really realized that other people weren't able to relate to it in the way that I was actually experiencing it. And I said to my husband, what this makes me realize now, that for a lot of the time it actually felt like I was walking around in the world with this invisible kind of goldfish bowl over my head. So other people couldn't see it. I looked perfectly normal. My speech was perfectly normal. But it meant that I could see, but I couldn't hear. And so it kind of like created this extra issue, which is often the case with invisible disabilities, that people were expecting me to be able to hear. And of course I couldn't. So it really did feel this, like, if you can imagine just walking around with this invisible goldfish bowl over your head, that's what that experience was like. And then in terms of being autistic, it was really interesting actually, because in order to go through the assessments and obviously get that kind of recognition of being autistic at the end of it, I had to focus very much on my struggles. And that wasn't easy for me. It really made me realize like how much I don't relate to being autistic as a struggle generally. If I'm, in order to get to the truth of what was going on, I needed to talk about the struggles, but it very much was alien to me because I've already alchemized so much of this into what I now relate to as a superpower. So, I mean, I could easily read the whole psychiatrist's report to you, but in short, it was struggles with things like, I guess, basic social skills, which over the years I've kind of learned to adapt, learned how to understand what people mean when it wasn't necessarily evident to me. I'm very very challenged in terms of reading between the lines. It's just something that just doesn't come naturally to me. I'll tend to take things very literally. There's been quite a few things recently between Sarah and I where she's not used to that part of me yet. So she'll say something that's a joke or expecting me not to take literally, and then I'll respond to it taking it literally. And then she's like, oh, I forgot again. That's what you do. Like, yeah, people who know me well know that about me, but Sarah's getting to understand that's how I am. Another thing is I'm extremely sensitive from a physical perspective. I mentioned earlier about people who have sensory sensitivities. I am extremely sensitive from a sensory perspective. So pretty much all of the senses, ironically, including sound, which is where I'm going to get to this in a minute, which is where the deafness is actually in some ways beneficial. So bright lights really affect me. Make me feel really unsettled, really on edge, really kind of like jangled, if that makes sense. Same with smells. I've got an extremely strong sense of smell, and if there's a smell that's particularly pungent and also one that I don't particularly like, I just can't settle. That will be something that I get obsessed with and need to deal with in some way or another. Had an interesting thing recently actually where I realized how strong my sense of smell is. For a few days, I kept saying to my husband, can you smell a smell that's a bit like gas or oil, something like that? He couldn't smell it. The children couldn't smell it. And it didn't make any sense. We're not on mains gas here. We live rurally, so we don't have mains gas. We use heating oil, but it's kind of like right the other side of the house. So there's no way. I mean, I couldn't even smell the smell as I went in that direction. So I knew it wasn't that. And it got to the point where I was saying to my husband, we're going to have to ring like the gas board or something, even though it doesn't make any sense. Like, we need to ring someone because this can't continue. There's obviously a problem here. Turned out our neighbours had a leak in their oil boiler, which is like, it was miles away, not miles away literally, but like quite away from where I was saying I could smell this smell. And so it turned out this oil leak I was smelling and had no realization that was obviously going on next door, and no one else could smell it. So it showed that not only am I like super sensitive from a experience point of view to smells, I actually can smell more. So yeah, that in one way or another is often quite problematic for me. If I walk in somewhere and there's like even a slightest smell of fish, like there's no way I could be there. And then, yeah, I'm not going to go on and on and on, but you can probably like join the dots now in terms of like how challenging it is for me to be in environments where I've got kind of like, it feels like this barrage of things hitting my senses. Let me try and think of some others. Again, it's so interesting how, because I don't focus on these anymore as struggles, and I'm going to explain how this is, it really was interesting for me to just spend the whole time during these assessments hyper focusing on how I struggle. And you can tell even now I'm like now struggling to think of how I struggle. Okay, let me think. Another way is I have a real attachment to routine. So the way that my day is structured is very routine based. It was funny when the psychiatrist said to my husband, does Leanne have a kind of like attachment to routines and things being done a certain way every day? And Chris said something like, yeah, our whole life is a routine or a process. And then the psychiatrist went, okay, can you give an example? And then he gave the example where every morning Chris brings me a cup of tea in bed, which is lovely and I appreciate it. But he said, the thing is, if I don't bring her that cup of tea in bed for whatever reason, he said it literally ruins her whole day. Like she can't function properly. It's like created this interruption with it. She'll then say to me like later on the day something like I still don't feel right because I didn't start my day with my cup of tea in bed, which sounds so spoiled. But that's the truth of the matter. If things have had this kind of interruption, it will create this sense like I don't feel right for the rest of the day. And the psychiatrist said, so what if your routines are interrupted? What would then happen? But it was so funny because it was such a struggle to think of examples other than the one that Chris gave, because life does generally follow those particular routines. So I don't often experience when it doesn't happen. But if, for example, I have a shower or a bath every morning, and if on a very rare occasion I had to kind of leave the house in an emergency and didn't have a shower, again, that would make me feel very just odd and not myself for the rest of the day. Not from necessarily from a cleanliness perspective, although that is something also that I'm quite focused on, but just again, more just from like, I don't feel right perspective. Okay, so hopefully that's given you an example of some of the ways I've struggled. And it was really interesting having spent that time really focusing on my struggles for the assessment. There was a very conscious choice on my part afterwards to redouble my focus on my vision, which includes allowing my differences to be superpowers. Like it really was something I had to consciously refocus on, because I could feel how focusing on those differences as struggled had really taken my focus away from that. It was a really interesting thing, noticing how I actually seemed to be struggling more for the week after getting that diagnosis. In fact, Jonathan actually said to me, you seem like more autistic than usual, where I seem to be misunderstanding more, getting more sensitive to things. And I think he was absolutely right. It was like having had that focus on how I struggle, I was actually struggling much more. And probably needing to kind of redouble my focus on my vision and what I'm creating in life is probably one of the reasons I've ended up creating this episode. I don't think it's a coincidence. I think that's part of that creation. Okay, just going to have another breather and then dive into what's next. Okay, so the thing I really, really, really want to emphasize here, this is so important. I believe that most differences only become struggles when we don't honor our needs. That's when we struggle. If we are holding our differences as both needs and superpowers, we then will struggle much, much less, if at all. So this is the thing that I really want to illuminate clearly here. It's only as we're overriding those needs that we will struggle. So this is something that, again, I think is so rare in our culture. We are bereft of role models, of people who are living in this way that allows themselves to honor themselves fully, including their needs. And it was only very recently, as I've been pondering all of these things, that I realized how fortunate I was to have a father who modeled this so well. This is not something we see around very often at all. So my father was almost certainly autistic as well. Not that we knew that at the time, just now looking back, it's obvious. And he created his life so beautifully and seemingly so naturally, as in it kind of wasn't even a thing, from this idea of honoring what worked for him, including what worked for him in terms of just lifestyle, how and where and when he wanted to work, really allowing himself to choose into relationships, businesses, ways of working that honored what he was really good at, but also really vocalizing the things that he needed in order for him to be able to thrive. And that for me, I think, has made such a difference to my own ability to do this. And again, in a way that I just had not recognized until very recently. So as an example, he, in his maybe last, it's quite a long time, maybe last 15, 20 years of his life, worked for, I think, a medium-sized company. And he worked as their he was extremely the opposite of me, extremely good with numbers, like unbelievable, like genius with numbers. And so he worked for a company who did things like huge projects, putting in kind of heating, darks and air conditioning for other buildings. And it's so quite a, what could you say, like almost a good example of a kind of traditional modern role, modern company, modern role within the company, if that makes sense. It wasn't kind of like some creative, artistic kind of environment. He certainly did do those types of things in earlier life, but certainly in the last 20 years he was working a very kind of traditional type of role in a quite traditional, in terms of the modern sense, company. And he created it into this place that worked for him so well. So for example, so that you wouldn't have to get up super early and kind of have to deal with commuter traffic, he didn't start work until kind of 10, 11, which was not the norm in that particular business. He then would just like work a bit later. He created a way that he had a team around him so he could delegate to people and like create like almost like an apprenticeship situation. So he had kind of people coming up the ranks that would learn for him, but also allowed him not to have to do all of the things that he wasn't necessarily as good at or didn't enjoy. So these sound very simple, but you could basically take the examples I've just given to you and apply them across his life. He literally designed his life in a way that allowed him to get all the kind of downtime, the alone time, the time where he could be really creative and connected. His whole life was created to allow him to have his needs met and to be his gift. So, of course, having that modeled to me meant that I've lived in a way where that just seemed like, oh, of course, that's what you do. I didn't need someone to kind of tell me that you can do that. I've seen it modeled. And so both with being deaf, being autistic, and again, that's like, it might sound like a simple thing, but being vegetarian, particularly back in the day, and then being vegan 25 years ago, which, believe me, wasn't that easy. Those things made me very good at asking for what I need and also encouraging other people to do the same. This is, again, this important thing. When we're modeling this, we allow others to do this too. So this is something that I am so clear on. Yes, I do have needs, and it is completely okay for me to honor those and express them and ask for help when I need it. So in really simple terms, what that looks like practically speaking, when I didn't work for myself, when I worked, when I was employed by other businesses, similar to my dad, I had in almost all of my jobs accommodations and flexibilities that allowed me, like I really, really struggle with getting up early in the morning and then getting to a certain place. I won't even go into details about why that is, just take my word for it. I am not at my best when I'm told to be at a certain place at a certain time, it's particularly if it's early. So I had flexibility and accommodations on location and hours, like the total hours that I work, starting time, in almost every role that I've ever had. I've also, in most of my roles, created a situation where I can be really in my zone of genius, and then will say, I need to recruit for people to, support me here, here, and here. So I'm a natural delegator, but I think a lot of it's for that reason, as in I recognize like I'm not so good at everything. I don't want to do everything. Therefore, it makes complete sense to me to ask for other people's help. And so, again, it comes really easily to me if I'm kind of, when I get back again, when I was still employed by others, within months, I'd normally have like, okay, I've now got a small team around me, then a bigger team around me, because it just made sense. Like, I don't need to do all of this. I'm not going to be good at doing all of this. Someone else will be. When it comes to, again, this is a really simple, practical example, but I really want you to hear in each one of these what's happening. If, for example, I go to a restaurant, because the lighting will bother me, because the air conditioning will bother me, because I might need accommodations to the menus because I'm vegan, I've got no problem with asking for those things. And I will do so in a way that is appreciative and respectful. Believe it or not, I'm quite popular in my local town with the various kind of cafe owners and restaurateurs. I've got a really good relationship with them. So it's not like I go there in this like demanding, entitled sense of, you need to make everything perfect for me. I very much approach everything in life as a win-win. And again, that is me honoring what I need. So that might be saying, I'm finding the little lighting a bit bright. Is it possible to turn it down? I'm finding the aircon's directed at me. Is it possible to move it, turn it down, move me? Is it possible to do this dish but without butter? Whatever it might be, I'm really happy to speak that need out. And I noticed that I could almost say 10 out of 10 times, but like, let's just say 9 out of 10 times, people are really, really happy to do what they can to meet those needs. I very rarely get the sense that people don't want to. Yeah, if anything, and particularly in the earlier days of being vegan, I quite often used to be told like, oh, the chef's really excited to be able to like do something a bit different. So it really recognized that by us being willing to express our needs, it gives someone else the opportunity to be their gift too. That is almost always the case. And then within my, I'm noticing I'm really running out of time here, but hey, as I said, this is a topic I really want to go deep into, so I'm going to take as long as I need to on this. So in terms of my current business, and also my life generally, I am so supported by other people in all the things that I need to be able to operate well, to thrive. And so whether that be Jonathan handles everything to do with tax and money in our business. He's also much, much better than I am at sort of keeping that big picture in mind. I can be very excited and in the moment and kind of sign up to do like a billion different things because they all feel exciting. And then Jonathan's great at saying to me, okay, Leanne, I appreciate all these things sound exciting, and how are you going to do all of these given you've also agreed to do this, this and this? And so it's not necessarily saying no, but just is really good at grounding it into those logistics that I am not so good at, like recognizing, oh, where I might think like that's going to take 10 minutes for this, 10 minutes for this, like recognize it's not going to take 10 minutes. Actually, it's going to take at least an hour and then half an hour either side for transition. That is not something that comes naturally to me. I really require someone to meet that need for me. And in this instance, it's Jonathan. Chris, my husband's really good at doing that also from a home perspective. Chris is also, as you heard earlier, so good at helping me in terms of allowing those routines that help me thrive be in place. You know, he's not someone who naturally would choose to live those that way in many instances, but he'll do that because he knows that that is a way that he can meet my needs and will, again, help the family to thrive. And then Sarah, absolutely brilliant at kind of joining the dots on the connections with other people that I'm not so good at. I'm good at certain types of connections and not others. And Asara is just absolutely brilliant at recognizing how we can connect in more intimate, more beneficial ways with all the different people that connect with us, connect with Team Wake in the Wild. So again, recognizing that I don't need to not have needs in order for everyone to be at their best, to be able to serve me and therefore me serve them. Okay, now I think this is the final section, moving on to how I see these differences of superpowers. Okay, so I'm going to again focus mainly on being deaf and then being autistic, because again, otherwise this show is going to be hours and hours long if I try to give you examples of everything. So being deaf, that has, as I say, that was a really, there was real struggles associated with that, and I absolutely can see that it meant that I had to hyper focus on people when they were talking to me. It allowed me to develop a skill of reading beneath what people were saying. So I absolutely can see that some of that's around reading lips, but also just like energy and body language. I'm constantly looking for something beneath what's being said, because again, for many times I just couldn't. I've got one particular memory of being in a team meeting in my last corporate job, and it was a massive room, so the audio is kind of like, or was much better in a kind of enclosed space, but if you can imagine, the kind of like the audio was like bouncing around the whole room, and we were sitting really far apart as well. And I remember thinking, for however long this meeting went on, I actually feel like I'm hearing almost nothing. Like, I'm not exaggerating, like practically nothing. And somehow I was managing to take part. It's not that it was easy. I'm not going to say it was easy at all. It was actually a real challenge, but I recognized, like, yeah, somehow I'm able to take in the kind of like the energetic of what's happening, and also take part in it in a way that's not making logical sense, because I'm really not able to hear what's going on. And so this allowed me to create this, or hone this skill of being able to hear beneath the words, see beneath the words, in a way I really don't think I'd have been able to do had I not experienced all those years of being deaf. The other thing that really was a gift, and I appreciated this much more when I got half my hearing back, was, given I am so sensitive to noise, it actually helped me cope quite a lot, because apart from anything, if I really didn't want to hear, I could just make sure this particular ear was covered. But it kind of created this kind of like dampening on the noise of the world. So it's certainly, whilst again there were struggles associated, it generally allowed me to be in situations that otherwise would have been much more challenging for me to be with. In terms of being autistic, it's really interesting, because it's so part of me. I think most autistic people would say the same. It's not really possible to think about me separate from being autistic. It is me. It is how my brain is wired. So there isn't a way that I can really say, like, without autism I would be like this. It just doesn't make sense to me to look at that. But what I can see is that most of what people appreciate about me, most of what makes me good at what I do, is actually traits that are because I'm autistic. I've got some examples here in the Wake the Wild Medicine group. It's an amazing group for being able to get feedback, get reflections in terms of your gifts and how other people receive you. And the group are constantly doing that to each other, both in when that's being asked for, but just generally, it's a very celebratory, seeing of each other gifts group of people. And here's some of the things that reflected to me that if I read through, I'm not going to read all of them, but I'm going to read some of them, because I think they're really will show you how these differences become superpowers. So these are things that people in Wake Smile Medicine have said about me. An ability to ask questions that makes someone go deeper to answer and magically gets them to look deep inside. This gift creates utter clarity around something. You have a genius level way of processing and holding information, spotting past patterns, and crucially, an ability to condense it into something that other people can understand and learn from. Your connection to spirit and or unseen realms allows messages to flow through you. I marvel at how you always have the exact right thing to say, even if it doesn't feel like the exact thing the person wants to hear. You have an inner sight of the multiverse and bring back knowledge and meaning learned seemingly elsewhere back here to this plane. I'm going to give you one more. Here's another one. You're brilliant at supporting people through inquiry, provocative questions, cut-through questions, and questions that illuminate healing possibility and potential. Actually, I'm going to read this last one as well, because I think this is really a really clear autistic trait. I get the image of a parachuter in World War II delivering a precise line of code behind enemy lines. I get a sense of your absolute brilliance, your precision, your knowledge of exactly what the moment requires. So thank you, first of all. If anyone's listened to this and recognises the feedback they gave me, it was, again, so beautifully received. Thank you. Really appreciate that. And I wonder if you can recognize how each of those things is very linked to autistic traits. So the first one, a couple of people there referenced kind of other worlds, this kind of like something beyond this plane. And this is something that I only found out very recently is linked to autism. I mentioned this on an interview I did with Charlie Wall a few weeks ago. And there's research that shows the autistic mind is actually wired to hypermetabolize innate DMT. So for those that don't know, DMT is known as the spirit molecule. It's what's present. It's the active component in plant medicines, hallucinogens. And so in short, my mind is naturally more psychedelic. I've actually had lots and lots of ways that's shown up for me over time in terms of seeing hallucinations, having what's known as scintillating catoma, where I'm kind of like seeing this kind of rainbowy crackling effect on reality. All sorts of strange ways that my mind behaves. I also go into other states of consciousness really easily. So I'm like uber hypnotizable. I can fall into a trance without even meaning to. And I certainly can fall into a trance very easily when I do mean to. So these are things that certainly in some ways have been challenges and can be seen as struggles, but they are ways that allow me to do what I do. So that connection that was mentioned here, this connection to spirit, unseen realms, inner sight of the multiverse, I believe that very much comes from that autistic trait that allows me to slip into other states of consciousness that for other humans would be more easily accessed by taking some kind of psychedelic, plant medicine or something like that. The next thing is that, as I mentioned a lot there, I naturally ask questions. I want to know and understand the detail of anything that I'm interested in. One of the traits of autistic people is often that we have like hyper obsessive focus on something that we're interested in. Certainly true for me. So from a very young age, I have asked questions relentlessly, asked why constantly, so that I know. And so you can see how, and that's sort of like honestly probably wound people up around me like to no end at certain points. And it's also a superpower in terms it does allow me to ask questions of other people to allow them to deepen into their own experience. It also, and again, you would have heard that in that feedback, I see patterns incredibly easily. Even when I'm not trying to, I'm constantly processing the world through seeing patterns and commonalities, and oh, that showed up like that, that's like this archetype, that makes sense because they're at this point in this particular process. So I'm not naturally empathic. I don't feel other people's feelings in the way that people traditionally talk about empathy. But what I'm very, very good at doing is understanding where people are in relationship to all the different patterns that make up life on this plane. Lastly, and this is quite meta, and I think this is actually true for anyone who has walked this path to hold their differences as superpowers, I am wired to see that in other people. I am constantly looking for how other people are different. I'm constantly looking at, so what would that mean that they need in order to be able to thrive? I'm constantly looking for how are those differences superpowers for them? How are they medicine for the world? That's something that comes so naturally for me. It's why I absolutely love the work I do. But I also believe this is something that anyone with a lot of differences that has done this work is relating to themselves and their own differences in this way. It makes us so open to see differences in others and honor them and value them and actually want more of them in the world. So really, if the kind of there's a personal message to anyone listening or watching to this in terms of like, I really hope you take this invitation I'm making to you to hold your own differences and superpowers. But the deeper invitation is that we do this for each other. We do this out there in the world. We recognize that the world is made of differences, and the more that we can honor them and love them, the more we'll all benefit. It really is, like, I truly believe that differences are the medicine that we all need. So if you would like to walk along this path, first of all, as I said right at the start, be truthful with yourself about your differences. And as I said, it's taken a long time for me to get clear on my differences, and that's included asking other people. So people who you can trust, people that you know have got your best interests at heart, ask them what they see as different about you. A lot of the differences for me that have come from being autistic, I actually didn't know about until other people started being honest with me and saying, I noticed that you really struggle here, or saying like, I find it really difficult when you suddenly got like, if someone, for example, is sharing something with me, I'll get hyper focused on a particular detail that to them is really irrelevant to the thing they're trying to tell me, but I'm like all my attention's there. I need to know this detail before I can carry on. And not realizing often that it was actually quite upsetting sometimes for people, frustrating, where I was like so focused on this particular detail and they wanted to move here. And so a lot of these differences have only been revealed when I've been open to receive that feedback from people who are close to me, and who, again, aren't people that are doing it to criticize me or to make me wrong, but just to allow me to know myself better. Then identify and honor your needs in a sovereign way. As I spoke about, our differences to a very large extent are only struggles when we are not honoring our needs. When we honor our needs in that sovereign way, not in a victimy way, not in a way where we're kind of like being entitled, when we're saying like, world, I can't function unless you're going to meet my needs, but in a sovereign way, that's how we need to honor our needs. Then lastly, identify what makes your different superpowers, what makes them gift the world, and then create your life in a way that allows you to use them in service of your vision. I've done many episodes where I've talked a lot more about creating that deep vision, that soul vision for yourself. And that to me is essential for us to really understand why we've got the differences we've got. We do really need to understand what we're here for. So that's a much longer conversation, but in short, allow yourself to see that beauty, the perfection in those unique differences that you have, so that you can use them in service of your vision, which again, ultimately is in your highest good and that of the world. Okay, so finishing up now. This has gone on. This is an extra long one, but hopefully it was worth it. I've certainly enjoyed being able to speak about these things. So a perfect place, beyond perfect place, if you are interested in harnessing your differences as superpowers in service of you doing your soul work, doing what you came here to do. Waking the Wild Medicine, which starts again in January 2022, is the place for you. So that's primalhappiness.co/medicine. Go have a look. We're already starting to speak to people about joining that next one. We're just in the last month, I think it is, month or two of our current Wake and Wild Medicine. Oh my gosh, just like such incredibly deep work. And again, the people in it are people who have these differences and are learning to harness them in service of being their medicine. So if that sounds like you, come join us there. Next, we've got Waking the Wild Feminine and Waking the Wild Masculine beginning in September. And Waking the Wild Feminine is already open for enrollment. It's almost full, but if you're feeling the call to that, go check it out and claim your space. Waking the Wild Masculine hasn't opened yet for enrollment. It will be soon, but you can register your interest. So they're at primalhappiness.co/WTWF or WTWM. Don't think you need me to explain which is which. If you are watching this on video or on live and you haven't yet checked out our podcast, why not go do that? That's at primalhappiness.co/podcast. There is over 300 episodes that I've recorded over the last 7 years or so. So yeah, wealth of goodness there. If you'd like to look at other ways that you can go deeper and walk this path of Wake the Wild, that is at primalhappiness.co/go deeper. Lastly, if you're not already a member of our Facebook group, oh my goodness, you have got a treat in store. As I said right at the start, this topic was voted for by our Facebook group members. So if you want to choose what I'll be speaking about next month, go do it and take part in a poll, which will be up soon for that next month's topic. And that's at facebook.com/group/primalhappiness. And it is a gorgeous group of people. Oh my goodness, I feel so appreciative of having this community of like-minded people. Again, people with a wide variety of differences, but coming together in celebration and sovereignty and authenticity. My goodness, some of the conversations that go down there are just like, wow. I love that people have been willing to be so open and honest in a space like this. So come join us if you're not already there. I think that's everything. I think we're done. Thank you so much for joining me, whether you've joined me live, watching the video replay, or on the podcast. I love you to bits. Have a wonderful rest of your Friday and a wonderful weekend. I love you. Goodbye. Mwah.